For decades, this pattern has been quietly emerging, almost invisible to the average citizen, because the mechanisms were designed to be opaque, technical, and slow-moving. The National Emergencies Act of 1976 was sold as a safeguard, a tool for rare, catastrophic scenarios, hurricanes, nuclear accidents, unforeseen military threats. Yet lawmakers structured it in such a way that the threshold for declaring an emergency is extraordinarily low, and the duration can stretch indefinitely unless Congress acts decisively, which it rarely does. Why was this ignored for so long? Because the public tends to equate crises with immediacy, with images on television or breaking news alerts, not with the slow accumulation of power behind legal clauses and budgetary reallocations. The seeds of this imbalance were sown decades ago, in a legislative culture that prized flexibility over restraint and in an executive office that learned how to navigate the gray areas of law with surgical precision. It created a sense of inevitability. Once emergency powers existed, it was only a matter of time before they would be invoked not for necessity, but for political leverage. The mechanics of the latest declaration are deceptively intricate. Funds appropriated for one purpose, military construction, border infrastructure, disaster relief, can be redirected under banner of an emergency. Federal agencies gain extraordinary latitude to act without standard regulatory oversight. Legal challenges are slow, and the courts often hesitate, citing the traditional deference owed to the executive on matters of national security and public safety. It is a machine that runs on procedure, on technical compliance, yet its consequences ripple far beyond paperwork. It shifts capital, influences contracts, and reshapes federal priorities overnight. The president's pen effectively rewrites the operational map of the government, while the broader public sees only sound bites about urgency or crisis. Who benefits? Contractors, defense suppliers, lobbying firms with deep connections to Congress, and political operatives who can capitalize on speed and ambiguity. Who loses? Small business owners caught in shifting regulatory landscapes, communities dependent on steady federal support, workers whose wages or jobs are disrupted by the sudden reallocation of funds. The tension is palpable, as short-term profit clashes with the stability that long-term governance demands. There is, however, a counterforce emerging. Lawmakers from the president's own party have begun to push back, questioning whether these powers are being stretched beyond their original intent. Will institutional resistance be enough to slow down what has been decades in the making, or will the momentum of precedent overpower the intent of framers? Meanwhile, the human cost is already visible. A family in El Paso watches construction on a promised border project stall because contracts were redirected. A single mother notices grocery prices inch upward as market uncertainty spreads from Washington to local suppliers. These are not abstractions. They are direct, measurable impacts on everyday life, subtle but accumulating, shaping how Americans experience the power of their own government. Beyond the borders, the world observes these maneuvers closely. Allies and adversaries alike read the capacity for unilateral action as a signal of unpredictability, recalibrating trade deals, military posture, and diplomatic engagement based on the American president's ability to declare emergency at will. And so, the moral question emerges. If the instruments of governance are wielded in ways that circumvent deliberation and transparency, what is the obligation of a citizen? Stability cannot be a luxury reserved for those who watch from the sidelines. It is a collective demand, a safeguard against the erosion of law by convenience, and a measure of whether society values accountability over spectacle. How much power is too much? How long will emergency become the default rather than the exception? These are questions each citizen must confront, for in the answers lie the health and resilience of the republic itself. This struggle has deep roots, stretching back to the very architecture of American governance. The framers intentionally dispersed power across branches, anticipating human ambition, factionalism, and error. Yet over decades, a combination of legal ambiguity and political pragmatism quietly eroded these safeguards. Scholars and legislators often debated the National Emergencies Act in abstract terms, imagining it as a fail-safe for nuclear accidents or rare calamities. Few recognized that its wording was sufficiently elastic to permit a president to redefine crises at will. This is why, when the law is invoked today, It carries the weight of inevitability, a slow-motion institutional drift that makes citizens feel as though they have no say in the consequences. Why did it go unnoticed? Because society tends to measure stability in visible outcomes, crime rates, unemployment numbers, border crossings, rather than in the structural integrity of the mechanisms that govern those outcomes. When a single actor gains the ability to circumvent legislative intent, the system becomes a high-stakes experiment in power concentration. The mechanics of this consolidation are subtle but effective. By declaring a national emergency, the president unlocks statutory powers that allow reallocation of funds across agencies, waiver of federal regulations, and operational control over programs originally designed for narrow purposes. Military construction funds can suddenly flow to projects unrelated to defense. Regulatory oversight that normally requires months of review can be bypassed entirely. Legal recourse exists, but the courts operate on slow timetables, often deferring to the executive under guise of national security. In practice, these powers allow a leader to alter the flow of capital, influence markets, and reshape domestic policy almost instantaneously. For ordinary citizens, these technicalities are invisible. The consequences are not. The winners are predictable. Politically connected contractors, lobbying firms, and private enterprises able to pivot quickly to capitalize on sudden funding or deregulation. The losers are anyone dependent on predictable governance, employees whose jobs hinge on stable contracts, small businesses navigating shifting regulatory landscapes, communities relying on consistent federal support. There is an inherent tension between short-term opportunism and long-term institutional health. Even within the president's own party, cracks are forming. Legislators increasingly ask, at what point does flexibility become unchecked authority? Can precedent alone justify the expansion of power, or must legal and ethical boundaries still restrain action? The implications are profoundly human. Consider the single parent whose city services are disrupted, or a mid-level manager whose project funding vanishes overnight. Governance is not an abstraction. It touches the wallet, the schedule, the very stability of life. Globally, allies and adversaries recalibrate their assumptions, measuring America's reliability against its institutional unpredictability. The stakes are clear. This is more than policy. It is a test of whether concentrated power can coexist with the principles that claim to guide it. How far can authority stretch before it breaks the social contract? What price does society pay when emergency becomes a default rather than the exception? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the lived realities of those navigating the consequences of power wielded without restraint. What is happening now inside the corridors of power is a subtle but tectonic shift, one almost invisible to anyone outside Washington. Yet its consequences could reshape the balance of authority for decades. For years, emergency declarations were treated as procedural inevitabilities, the sort of thing Congress would quietly allow while focusing on elections, budget battles, or partisan messaging. Now, however, cracks are appearing within the president's own party, and these cracks are not accidental. They are the consequence of accumulated precedent and growing discomfort with the concentration of executive authority. Senators and representatives, often the same individuals who have previously deferred to presidential will, are beginning to articulate a limit, a line that, until recently, seemed to exist only in theory. They are invoking war powers frameworks, procedural objections, and constitutional principles that have largely been dormant, not for ideological grandstanding, but because the tools meant to constrain power are being tested in ways that matter in real time. The question they face is stark. Can the legislative branch reclaim its role, or is inertia already too entrenched? The mechanics of this pushback are intricate. Senate rules, committee oversight hearings, and statutory veto powers are being dusted off and strategically wielded. Legal scholars draft opinions emphasizing that emergency powers are not limitless, and aides circulate memos showing that funding reallocations without clear legislative approval could be vulnerable to judicial challenge. Behind closed doors, lobbying groups and policy advisors are calculating the economic and political consequences, weighing whether to support a decisive stand or quietly acquiesce. The fight is not conducted on cable news or social media alone. It is a carefully choreographed struggle in the gray, procedural spaces that most citizens never see. This is where real governance occurs, where precedent is built or broken, and where the trajectory of institutional authority is determined. Yet even as these internal battles unfold, the human dimension cannot be ignored. A federal contractor anticipating project funding may now face delays, uncertainty, or sudden reprioritization. City administrators and social service managers watch anxiously as funding pipelines shift under legal scrutiny, unsure whether initiatives critical to education, public health, or safety will continue uninterrupted. The ripple extends to workers, parents, and households whose stability depends on predictable governance. Even a single senator's procedural maneuver can have real, tangible effects on the lives of millions, because governance is not abstract. It is the architecture of daily existence. At a geopolitical level, this moment is scrutinized by allies and adversaries alike. Diplomats, economists, and foreign leaders assess whether the American executive remains predictable or is now capable of unilateral maneuvers that disrupt trade agreements, military alliances, and regional stability. The irony is stark. What appears to be a domestic procedural skirmish signals, worldwide, the robustness or fragility of American democracy. The moral stakes are unmistakable. If a system built to balance power allows unilateral expansions without consequence, citizens and the world are forced to reckon with the true cost of convenience over deliberation. How far will institutions bend before the principles they were designed to uphold are compromised? Can pushback within the party restore equilibrium, or is this the moment when precedent overtakes principle, leaving ordinary people to absorb the fallout? These are not theoretical dilemmas. They are the pulse of governance itself, beating quietly behind the headlines. The technical architecture of emergency powers is deceptively precise, almost surgical in its design, yet carries consequences that ripple far beyond law books and legislative chambers. Each provision of the National Emergencies Act and related statutes was conceived with a narrowly defined purpose to respond to sudden, tangible crises that could not wait for the slower rhythms of Congress. A hurricane flattening a coastal city, a chemical spill threatening thousands, an unexpected military strike. These were scenarios envisioned. They were not intended to serve as instruments for advancing domestic political objectives or for circumventing the checks and balances that form the backbone of constitutional governance. And yet, that is exactly how these powers are now being wielded. When invoked, they immediately unlock a suite of extraordinary authorities. Federal funds can be redirected with minimal scrutiny, regulatory requirements can be waived, and federal personnel can be deployed to implement policies with near total discretion. This is a legal lever of immense force, capable of reshaping priorities across the entire federal apparatus almost overnight. What makes this moment particularly precarious is the deliberate friction built into the system. Congress retains the authority to terminate a national emergency, but the process is cumbersome by design. Historically, lawmakers have structured rescission as a high-barrier exercise, requiring substantial coordination, consensus, and political will, conditions that rarely exist in a divided or distracted legislature. That intentional delay means that an executive declaration often stands unchallenged for months, sometimes years, allowing policies and allocations to take effect and entrench themselves before any legislative review can occur. This is not bureaucratic accident. It is a result of decades of partisan negotiation, legal drafting, and institutional compromise that, over time, shifted the balance of power toward the executive branch. Each precedent reinforces the notion that unilateral action is feasible and low risk, subtly recalibrating what leaders believe they can achieve without accountability. The human stakes of these mechanisms are immediate and tangible. Federal contractors adjust their project timelines to align with reallocated funds. Local governments scramble to comply with altered directives, and public programs face disruption. Even a single executive decision can ripple through municipal budgets, employment projections, and procurement schedules. Citizens may not see the memos or legislative filings, but they experience the outcomes in higher prices, delayed services, or canceled initiatives. Globally, allies monitor these legal maneuvers closely. A declaration framed as domestic policy may influence trade negotiations, military cooperation, and diplomatic confidence. If Washington can pivot rapidly on a whim, partners must hedge accordingly. The moral weight of these legal structures cannot be overstated. When technical authority exists without immediate accountability, the boundary between necessary action and overreach blurs. Citizens are left to wonder, if law permits such sweeping discretion, where does responsibility reside? How should society respond when legality is no longer a reliable measure of legitimacy? In the quiet corridors of policy and law, the rules may be followed perfectly, yet the human consequences, disruption, uncertainty, diminished trust, accumulate relentlessly. In this tension between technical authority and ethical governance lies a question every society must confront. Does a mere ability to act justify its exercise, or is restraint the true measure of power? The moment these abstract legal powers are exercised, they leave an unmistakable imprint on everyday life, far beyond the stately halls of Congress or the echoing corridors of federal agencies. Markets, exquisitely sensitive to uncertainty, respond instantly. Investors, accustomed to projecting risk and reward, pull back when they detect the tremors of unilateral executive action. Stock indexes fluctuate, often violently, as algorithms and human traders alike attempt to price in the unpredictable. Corporations, wary of sudden regulatory shifts or fund reallocations, delay hiring, freeze bonuses, and put expansion plans on hold. This is not an academic exercise. These are deliberate decisions made to protect profit margins and minimize exposure to an unstable policy environment. The consequences cascade downward, where ordinary citizens feel the friction most acutely. Families balancing mortgages, parents calculating tuition, and workers budgeting for groceries suddenly confront a world reshaped by choices made thousands of miles away. Consider a small manufacturing plant in the Midwest, where hiring was planned to accommodate a growing order book. Suddenly, federal contracts are redirected, or tariffs shift the cost of imported materials. The plant pauses recruitment, delays pay raises, and recalibrates production schedules. A single executive decision in Washington has just rippled into paychecks, job security, and household planning. The uncertainty is tangible. Workers hesitate to spend, businesses hesitate to invest, and communities collectively experience the quiet anxiety that follows the perception of instability. The psychological effect compounds the financial one. When citizens sense that government mechanisms are unpredictable, they adopt defensive behaviors, delaying major purchases, holding back investment in education or property, and generally constraining economic activity. What was intended as a narrowly defined emergency intervention becomes a systemic force, shaping behavior in real time. This dynamic also reveals stark inequities. Large corporations, lobbying firms, and wealthy investors can navigate volatility with legal teams, market insight, and political connections. The small business owner, the single parent, the hourly worker, these are the individuals for whom uncertainty translates directly into stress, financial vulnerability, and opportunity cost. A decision that may appear procedural or technical on paper manifests as postponed promotions, lost wages, and disrupted local economies. Main Street absorbs the shocks of policy almost immediately, long before media narratives frame the event. Even beyond domestic borders, these mechanisms ripple outward. International markets track the stability of American institutions as closely as they do interest rates or trade agreements. Allies and competitors alike reassess commitments, recalibrate investments, and weigh the likelihood that Washington's next move might alter the global economic landscape. For citizens, this is a reminder that law, policy, and executive power are not abstract constructs. They are forces shaping the contours of daily life, livelihoods, and future opportunity. How can society remain resilient when the structures meant to ensure stability become instruments of volatility? How long can ordinary people shoulder the costs of political maneuvering before accountability must be demanded? The abstraction of governance suddenly becomes painfully concrete when it touches the contents of a grocery cart or the balance of a bank account. When Washington behaves less like a deliberative institution and more like a high-risk market player, the ripple effects are immediate and personal. Emergency tariffs, ostensibly justified as protective measures or crisis responses, reverberate through supply chains, increasing the cost of raw materials and finished goods. Electronics that were once affordable now carry an unexpected premium. Food staples rise in price because distributors hedge against regulatory uncertainty and fluctuating import fees. The ordinary consumer, the person balancing work, rent, and family expenses, is forced to absorb what are effectively the indirect costs of executive power exercise without traditional checks and balances. It is not merely inconvenience. It is erosion of economic stability. Local retailers delay restocking or pass higher costs directly to customers. Restaurants adjust menus, reducing portions or increasing prices to maintain profit margins. Even public services, funded partially through federal allocations, can face interruptions or scale back operations as budgets are reprioritized under emergency directives. What appears in law books as minor reallocations or regulatory waivers manifests as tangible scarcity, higher prices, and anxiety over basic needs. Ordinary workers rarely consult the Constitution before purchasing a loaf of bread. Yet they feel the consequences of legal maneuvers made hundreds of miles away. The fiscal impact is immediate. Families spend more for less, save less, and confront mounting uncertainty about their ability to meet monthly obligations. The broader economic psychology compounds the damage. Businesses, observing instability, adopt defensive strategies, delaying expansion, freezing hiring, or investing in hedges rather than growth. This creates a feedback loop where the impact on individual households spreads to community economies, slowing development and reducing opportunities for upward mobility. The invisible hand of policy transforms into a visible weight on daily life, shaping decisions long before media coverage frames the event as significant. Citizens' lived experience becomes a ledger of volatility, a daily reminder that executive action is not merely political theater, but a force with measurable personal consequences. Globally, this behavior signals unpredictability. Allies assess risk in trade negotiations. Investors reconsider the reliability of contracts. Supply chains spanning continents are recalibrated based on perception that American policy may pivot on a unilateral declaration. The stakes are both domestic and international. What price does society pay when stability is subordinated to expedience? How long can ordinary people absorb the costs of power wielded without restraint? In the details of a grocery receipt, a monthly budget, or a delayed paycheck, the abstract tension between institutional authority and human consequence becomes undeniable. Governance, in this sense, is not distant lawmaking. It is a material reality of life itself, and when power is exercised with volatility rather than deliberation, citizens bear the weight first. This is where the abstractions of law, policy, and executive authority collide with the lived reality of millions. The ripple effects of so-called emergency declaration are neither theoretical nor distant. They manifest in kitchens, classrooms, and workplaces across the country. A single parent wakes each morning weighing whether to attend work or care for a sick child because federal services, dependent on redirected funds, have faltered. That parent is not thinking about statutory language or legislative procedure. They are thinking about survival, stability, and the ability to provide. A teacher, once able to rely on a steady flow of resources for educational programs, now faces cuts or delays because Congress hesitates to challenge the executive branch, leaving school systems underfunded and overextended. The erosion of institutional checks is measured not in legal opinions, but in the diminished opportunities and increased stress of ordinary people. For young graduates, the picture is equally stark. Entering a job market already fragile, they encounter employers frozen in uncertainty, hesitant to expand payrolls or offer training programs, while the reverberations of an emergency declaration distort investment decisions. Professional ambitions are postponed, wages stagnate, and debt burdens grow heavier because the machinery of governance has been converted into a tool of volatility rather than stability. Small business owners, particularly those relying on federal contracts or predictable regulatory environments, are forced to adjust, often drastically. Supply chains are disrupted, contracts renegotiated or canceled, and every decision becomes a gamble. The impact is not confined to spreadsheets. It is felt in lost hours, reduced income, and deferred dreams. Globally, the consequences echo across borders. International investors, multinational corporations, and allied governments monitor these unilateral moves closely. A declaration framed as domestic emergency signals uncertainty to the world, prompting recalibration of trade agreements, adjustment of investment strategies, and heightened geopolitical caution. When markets and governments perceive unpredictability at the core of American decision-making, it increases the fragility of global economic systems and complicates alliances built on trust and consistency. What may appear as a brief domestic maneuver thus carries weight in the corridors of power from London to Tokyo, from Berlin to Riyadh. The moral dimension is inescapable. Citizens bear the real-world costs of institutional erosion, disrupted routines, financial instability, and constrained opportunities. The question is stark. Should legality alone dictate the exercise of power, or must governance be measured by its capacity to preserve the lives and livelihoods of those it purports to serve? If the well-being of families, workers, and students is subordinated to procedural expedience, then the social contract is fractured. Democracy is not defined solely by the letter of law. It is defined by its impact on human life, and when law and authority are wielded without restraint, the human cost becomes unavoidable. How long can society endure governance that treats people as variables rather than citizens? And what must be demanded of leaders if the answer is to preserve not only order, but justice, stability, and human dignity? At the heart of this moment lies a fundamental question about the kind of society we wish to inhabit. Citizens are not passive observers. They're the guarantors of institutional integrity, the ones whose daily lives are shaped by the boundaries that separate lawful authority from unchecked power. Transparency is not a luxury. It is a prerequisite for legitimacy. When leaders cloak their actions in spectacle or urgency, they shift the focus from accountability to theater, and the machinery of governance begins to serve performance rather than purpose. What is unfolding in Washington is emblematic of a deeper tension, the clash between immediate, unilateral action and the patient, deliberate processes that have historically kept power in balance. The choice is not abstract. It manifests in policy, funding, regulations, and ultimately in the lived experience of millions. Citizens deserve leaders who see institutions not as obstacles to bypass, but as structures to strengthen, to uphold, and to respect. Without that reverence, authority becomes a tool for convenience rather than service, and legality without legitimacy corrodes the social contract. Consider the broader implications. When crises are manufactured or stretched to justify authority, the pattern extends far beyond domestic policy. Markets become cautious, international partners uncertain, and public trust erodes. The global perception of American governance hinges not on speeches or press conferences, but on the consistency, predictability, and fairness of its institutions. A republic that allows precedent to outweigh principal signals to the world that power, not law, dictates outcomes. This is why understanding the mechanics, consequences, and limitations of executive authority is not merely academic. It is essential for anyone who relies on stable governance to secure livelihoods, communities, and nations. It is why informed citizens are indispensable to maintaining balance in a system that can, if left unchecked, drift towards centralization and volatility. Ultimately, the moral center of governance is human. It is measured in the confidence of a parent planning for the future, a student preparing for opportunity, a worker relying on stability. Laws, procedures, and emergency powers exist to serve people, not the other way around. When authority is wielded without restraint, the consequences are tangible, pervasive, and personal. The question that remains is whether society will demand restraint, oversight, and ethical use of power, or whether it will accept convenience as a defining standard for leadership. Your understanding, your scrutiny, and your voice are not optional. They are the stabilizing force that ensures a republic remains a republic. It is in demanding transparency, insisting on accountability, and valuing principle over spectacle that citizens protect the integrity of their institutions. In the struggle between concentrated power and democratic resilience, the responsibility rests not only with those in office, but with every individual who recognizes that freedom, stability, and justice are earned and maintained, never given for granted.